Always wide awake is Oliver Callan, and you can get the rest of Callan's kicks this evening on this channel, Radio 1, RTE Radio 1 at 6:30 now. Staying with the political theme, I am joined in studio by our panel of Patrick O'Donovan, Minister of State with responsibility for sport. He's also Fine Gael TD for Limerick. Brid Smith is here of AAA, People Before Profit TD for Dublin South Central. Katie Hannon is RTE Primetime's political correspondent. And I also want to welcome Mick Clifford of the Irish Examiner, and recently named as Journalist of the Year at the recent News Brands Awards. Michael, just you can recover from that reminder. But I want to turn to you first of all, Brid Smith. Another week of Landsdown Road is dead. Long lives Lansdowne. Do you think the government needs to act more urgently to deal with pay demands across the board, or are they right to hold the line?
I think the government are coming under severe pressure. I mean, you don't come through a recession of 8 years and haven't asked workers to tighten their belt, work for free, X amount of hours, give up on a deal like Haddington Road, bring them into Landsdown Road, and then begin to make concessions to groups like the Gardaí and say to the rest of the people like nurses and teachers, you can't have pay restoration, you can't have pay equality, and we're going to hold the line on this. It doesn't work that way. People feel the pressure because rents, mortgages, insurance costs, medical costs are all gone through the roof, and they haven't been able to reward workers for what they're calling the recovery, the continued recovery. Bríd,
does it all come back to that Labour Court recommendation a fortnight ago that the Gardaí get a pretty good deal, at least as other workers would see it? We don't know if they see it in those terms, but is that something that, if you like, burst the dam?
Well, the dam was under pressure anyway, but I do agree that was probably the last straw. And certainly immediately afterwards, the nurses' unions and others were lining up to say, if they can pay the Gardaí $3,000 next year, then we want pay restoration and we want pay equality. I mean, sometimes people talk about these things in terms as if it's just about figures. But actually, when you listen and work with and go through the issues with nurses, pay inequality and the strain that they are working under and the extra hours that they are given has them totally demoralised. And it is leading to a crisis in our health services because they can't recruit people. If you don't treat public sector workers carefully and correctly, then you won't recruit them. 5,000 nurses have left the country in the last few years because the pay and the conditions are terrible. And that's going to happen across the board. I'm not saying they need to be treated with kid gloves, but certainly if you're going to treat the Gardaí one way, you need to treat everybody equally.
Same time, we see pressure building for expenditure in other areas, and transport is one that you're familiar with, I think, from your trade union days, Brid Smith. We see figures now coming out from Iarn Road there, and they want to have a public discussion about particularly 4 routes, Limerick to Ballybrophy, Gorey to Rosslare, Limerick Junction to Waterford, and then that section of the Galway to Limerick line between Ennis and Athenry. They can't have money for everything. Do you think we're going to see closures of those lines?
Well, I think there needs to be a really serious look at what's going on here. The recent EPA report on the air quality shows that there are 1,200 people a year dying in this country because of poor air quality. And the EPA, that's the Environmental Protection Agency, put that down to CO2 emissions from cars and buses and trucks and freight. And really, what we really need to have a serious look at what we're doing. We're missing out on our targets to reduce our CO2 by 6 to 11%.
What's that got to do with the €552
it has a lot to do with it.
Of a trip, an individual trip between Limerick and Ballybrophy?
I don't understand why a trip between Limerick and Ballybrophy costs that much. I genuinely cannot figure that out.
Well, because there's so few people on the service,
no,
they can't even pay for the diesel.
Well, I can tell you this, Sean. Public transport in this country receives the least subsidy of any country in Europe. Any of the big countries in Europe. Now, when we had disputes with the bus drivers in Dublin Bus recently, Shane Ross said he had no chequebook, he wasn't going to intervene, etc., etc. But yet, when you look at it, Dublin Bus received a subvention of 58 million annually. Last year I think it was 58 million, might have increased slightly. And yet we give 50 million subvention to the company that run the national toll roads. So we're encouraging cars onto roads at the expense of both the environment and public transport. I think there has to be a huge investment in public transport, and issues like a very expensive link between Ballybrovey and Limerick certainly has to be looked at, but then we need to be opening up more railway lines and putting more buses onto the road rather than looking at public transport as a problem. The problem with public transport is the underfunding of it.
But keep them open. Is that the reassurance that you want to offer the people?
Well, no, I mean, we're not going to make a decision here, but I mean, the public will have an opportunity to consult, and ultimately the decision will rest with Éireann Rud Éireann in conjunction with the Department of Transport.
That's a very sensible suggestion, to put a train station near in the Plessy estate and near the university.
We agree on something.
It's not rocket science. It's a very sensible suggestion. Not just keep them open, but open more. I mean, there's train stations in Park Weston and Ballyfermot that aren't open. Do you know, and trains come through them all the time. They're not necessarily rapid trains, the service isn't suitable, but there needs to be a lot of rethinking on how we run our trains, and we need more of them.
Okay.
So it's just going to be really interesting, and I'm sure
he hasn't softened his approach one bit on climate change, which is probably the more worrying thing.
The single,
pulling out of Paris, and that impacts on all countries, impacts on all of us. Not that Paris was any great shakes, but his attitude to climate change, like those scientists who talk about climate change, are in the, what does he call them, the dark, and some like an expression out of Star Wars. It's really bizarre stuff. It's a bit like the Healy rays saying there is no climate change.
Well, one of them, don't blame the two of them.
Okay, it's only gone upstairs. But Donald Trump versus Healy Ray, it's a different story. But I think it's very worrying, and it has huge global implications. I also think the fact that his first international visitor was
the Prime Minister of Japan,
No,
Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage was the first to actually fly over to see him.
Proper leader.
Proper leader was the letting-on leader, Nigel Farage. I think that was very worrying, and the fact that Marie Le Pen is declaring herself almost elected on the foot of Donald Trump's election. Oh, this is great for me. I'll be in next year. So there really is a battle on for the hearts and minds of the world. But the more interesting thing is how American society itself is reacting. And there's wonderful films on YouTube of kids in schools having protests against Trump's racism, against his sexism. Thousands of children marching out of the schools and saying, this is not my president, this is not my country.
The point about that, though, is surely that's anti-democratic. He hasn't done anything yet. When he does something as president that is objectionable, by all means protest. If you protest now, you're protesting against the democratic process.
No, sure, but I think the instinct of the protesters is to say we reject homophobic racism and the idea that you can scapegoat minorities to deflect from what's really going on.
Yeah, but he hasn't done anything.
But his rhetoric. His rhetoric is what they're protesting about, and the threat that he poses to the world.
For 8 years, the last time there was a Republican.
Well, he didn't delay in appointing Bannon, one of the most extreme right-wing white supremacists. There was no delay, no second thought about that. Straight away, his main man, Bannon, in, and something that's really frightening.
One big test.
At least Pat Hickey has the option of coming out of jail on 400,000. Ibrahim Halawa has been abandoned by the government and is there for the last 4 years and doesn't have the option of paying a bail bond for it.
We'll leave it at that. Thanks for joining us. That's Brid Smith, AAA People Before Profit TD.